ProTax. Welcome to ProTax Resiliency Dialogue Workshop number 10 today, right? And we are very excited today to have some of our closest collaborators and allies, CCNC-SJ, the Chinese Canadian National Council for Social Justice, with us today. So I would like to welcome our panel speakers very shortly. But before then, we would like to welcome you all into the seminar. And we would like to find out who our participants are. So if we can get you to fill out a very quick survey, that would be much appreciated. So we'll just give a minute or so. We have participants still coming into the seminar and also filling out the survey. So thank you. Okay, are we ready? So we would like to start the session by acknowledging our land. So if Rain, if you can start.
Hi everyone, so it's Rain here. I'm also one of the staff here with ProTech. So before we begin, we would like to pay our gratitude and respect to and acknowledge that we are gathered on the sacred land covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed with the multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. Toronto is located on a dish with one spoon territory. It is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississauga, and the Haudenosaunee that bounds them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and all other newcomers were invited to this treaty as well in the spirit of peace and friendship and respect to share and care for the resources of this land. We are aware of the ongoing impact of colonialism, racism, and other forms of discrimination and social injustices that disproportionately impacts Indigenous people, as well as other racialized communities here on Turtle Island. We stand in solidarity to continue our fight against anti-Indigenous, anti-Black, anti-Asian, Islamophobia, and any other forms of racism and social oppressions locally and globally.
Thank you, Rain. So we also wanted to, would you like to explain the guidelines for the webinar as well?
Sure. So essentially, this webinar here, you will notice that there is a function in the chat where you can, if you click on the drop-down menu, you can click all panelists and attendees. If you want to type a question or comment to everybody, you can just type in for all panelists and attendees. Of course, we do have some guidelines. We want to make sure that we are respecting everyone here today. So we want to make sure that everyone knows that we don't want to have any harassments of any kind here. And make sure that we respect everyone's and make sure everyone gets a turn to speak. If you do want to speak and you want to turn on the mic, you can just let us know, and we can with the raise hand function, and we will let you speak. In the newer Zoom editions, the raise hand section is under the reactions. But otherwise, if you click on participants, it's also in participants. So it might be in a few different places depending on what versions you have. And, making sure that there's no background noises. We are turning on the mics. And and I believe that's it. And
That's great. Thank you. So I always forget to introduce ourselves. So Rain, as you have met, they are the community engagement coordinator of Project Protect, and also assisting with our technical um, proceeding tonight is our project manager, Keith Wong, and myself, Alan Lee, is the community engagement research team lead of Project Protect. So we are very happy to spend the next hour with you and with our friends from CCNC-SJ. So just a note of disclosure, I think all of us here have ties and roots with CCNC. I've been with CCNC National, Rain's been with CCNC Toronto, and Keith also with CCNC Toronto. So it's kind of like a really great reunion. So I'm very excited. So we are very happy to have three of our friends from CCNC-SJ, CCNC for Social Justice, Amy Go, Brad Lee, and Victoria Yeung. And maybe you can quickly introduce yourselves to our friends here. Amy, you want to
Yep.
start?
So I'm the president of Chinese Canadian National Council for Social Justice, and thank you very much, Protec, for inviting us to this forum. And we are excited to again be engaged in this important dialogue as we are combating not just the virus of COVID, but the virus of racism. So thank you.
Brad?
Hi, my name's Brad Lee. I'm the content strategist and writer for the FaceRace Campaign. I've worked off and on with CCNC-SJ as well as other iterations of social justice groups in the community. I had my first, I guess, bigger participation during the redress campaign, which resulted in the parliamentary apology for the Head Tax and Exclusion Act. I've been involved, as I said, off and on with this community group because I think that it actually works a lot on protecting our identity as Chinese Canadians and helping create a better sense of community belonging.
Thanks, Brad. Victoria?
Hi everyone, my name is Victoria. I'm the project coordinator with CCNC-SJ. Thanks so much for having me. I feel like we're at a really historic moment right now and for the racial justice movement. And I hope that, you know, with the veil being lifted on everything with the pandemic, that we all invested in community healing, solidarity with other groups of color who experience racism, and to divest from these ideas of assimilation and inclusion so that we can imagine something better. Thanks so much for having me here.
Thank you for being here. So I think as you mentioned that, you know, this is actually like a very historic moment, and this is almost a year into the pandemic. And, you know, we started this project, Project Protect started because we were anticipating and also already experiencing a lot of racism since the beginning, right? So over the months, we've seen social injustices and inequities not only affecting the Chinese Canadian community, but extended to a lot of racialized and marginalized groups as well. So I think it is really timely for us to reconnect and also look at how CCNC-SJ's and Protect's work connects to the larger issues of anti-racism work, right? So maybe Amy, you can kind of connects us to, you know, how CCNC-SJ positions itself and also the different anti-racism work that you've been doing over the last year.
So thank you, Alan. Chinese Canadian National Council for Social Justice, it's a relatively new organization. We started in 2019. However, the people who established CCNC-SJ are definitely not new in the social justice movement. All of us are involved in the prior Chinese Canadian National Council that, as Brad mentioned, was very involved in since 1980 in racial justice and fighting for the rights of the minority communities and racialized communities in Canada, including spearheading the Head Tax and Exclusion Act redress movement. And CCNC-SJ was established because the group of us felt that there has been a void in the social justice movement of voices from Chinese Canadian communities. Um, and this the engagement of community and working in solidarity with other racialized communities is critical in advancing the rights and equality for all of us. And so CCNC-SJ actually established in fact, September 2019, and then January 25th, the first case of COVID-19 hit Canada. In fact, before then, we already knew that the COVID has hit China. And we knew that the globalization of traveling and all that, we knew that's going to come to Canada. And so early on, CCNC-SJ came out together with a number of community groups to raise the alarm about the potential impact of COVID in the Chinese Canadian community in particular. We knew what the communities have had to live through SARS, and we anticipated that it's going to repeat in terms of the racism, in terms of the attacks and targeting and the stereotyping of Chinese Canadian community, just like we have experienced in SARS. And unfortunately, all our predictions have come true, and even worse. It just turned out to be far worse than we all have anticipated. So that's this last year, Chinese Canadian National Council, together with Chinese and Southeast Asian Legal Clinic, Chinese Canadian National Council Toronto chapter, and Civic Engagement Network in Vancouver, got together and got some funding from Heritage Canada to launch a project to combat anti-Asian racism. And today, we are discussing is part of that campaign, and it's about it's an online resource tool that Brad and Victoria will share more in greater detail, and it's called the FaceRace Campaign. So before I actually move on to a bit more about the project, I'm going to ask Rain to host a poll and engage our participants in a question. So we'll just, we'll hear from you, and then we'll further our discussion after. So the question is, you can see, is how many racism incidents targeting Chinese Canadian communities have been reported since COVID in Ontario and BC? You can pick more than one answers, I believe.
Can they?
I think so. They should. I hope so. If not, then
Sure,
pick the best one. Okay, so we're gonna close it. Can we close it? Have we? Actually, usually you can. We should. Can we see the response from the participants? Great. So as part of the project that CCNC and our partners have worked on, one of the aspects is a online reporting tool. It's called covidracism.ca, and it's hosted by Chinese Canadian National Council Toronto chapter. And through that, any public can report their individual experience when it comes to attack, be it in public, be it in a workplace, and online, that they have experienced or they have witnessed. And through this COVID racism website, we have collected over about 400 incidents since the beginning, and since February 2020. And together with our partner in Vancouver, an organization called Project 1907, They have collected over close to 300 incidents. So the two organizations have worked together because they have a similar tool, and CCNC Toronto also has a similar tool. So we have collaborated in reporting and analyzing the data. The first set of reports came out in September, and we are soon to announce our a whole year of data in fact, probably in a few weeks. And the data will capture both the Toronto incidents, the incidents reported in the Toronto website, as well as the incidents reported on the Vancouver website. And what we're hoping to do is to, of course, illustrate the devastating personal impact of COVID and COVID racism. But more importantly, we want to illustrate that, unfortunately, most of these incidents are not reported, as you have just said. Most of the people are still too afraid to come out, to speak up, and to report incidents that they have personally encountered or they have witnessed. So stay put, and we will, as soon as we have the report, we will make the public announcement, and hopefully we can engage in further discussion about how we can collectively support each other in these incidents. So now I'm going to turn to Brad. He is going to share with us his actually baby, the FaceRace campaign, and his insights and thoughts that he has devoted to share those tremendous amount of resources that is now housed in this in our website.
All right. Hey, thank you very much for everybody for joining us for this Project Protect sponsored presentation of our FaceRace campaign. I'm just going to share it now. So when all this started with, we're a year into the pandemic and everything like that, I was actually at the time that COVID started hitting the news, I was actually overseas in Singapore celebrating the New Year, the Lunar New Year. In the context of being in Singapore, the city was mobilizing because, I mean, they're a lot closer to reports of this mysterious virus in China, and they were going through various levels of alertness and everything like that. I was actually very amazed because they have this sense of logistics that is just absolutely amazing. They are a small country, but they had mobilized, and they felt that everybody needed masks, and not a lot of people had them. So the government mobilized to the point where they were able to deliver to every single Singaporean household 4 masks for the family. And they were meant to be used by anybody that was health compromised or that felt that they'd already had some sort of virus or were infected, to protect others in the household. I was very, very curious about what was happening back in my home country, which is Canada. And so I did a quick Google search to find out what was happening. And this, so, Chinese New Year's was January 25th last year. And I looked on Google, and so I did Canada virus. And the first things that came up were a bunch of reports about racist attacks, blaming Chinese Canadians or anybody that looked Chinese for this mysterious virus. I was shocked. And I say so because my perspective is that I am actually, I'm a 4th generation Chinese Canadian. My great grandfather arrived in Canada in 1898. In terms of my Canadian identity and who I feel I am, yes, I look Chinese, I am Chinese, but I'm far more Canadian. So to see that this was the response of my country to this threat of a virus, and to see it was racism, I was ashamed, I was disappointed, and I was waiting just to get home to find out what was going on. Now, we traveled back early on. By that time, the news of the virus had spread a bit more, and what people were doing. There were still no public health measures being taken in Canada. In fact, most of the time the government was saying, "Oh well, we've dealt with SARS before, so it's no big deal. Don't worry about it." And yet, the incidents, the danger of the virus and the pandemic was spreading. And so, we got home and we actually went into a voluntary self-isolation. We tried to stay away from people. And we've been basically doing this, for this week, an entire year. So, I was asked by CCNC-SJ to get involved. And I felt that because of this experience of seeing what was happening in Canada, I felt that one of the really important things to do would be to document the experience and the living history of racism against Chinese Canadians during the pandemic. This is a really important approach for me because by documenting and sort of curating various stories in this website about that experience, we have a solid and a concrete record of what the community has been experiencing. Now, so what I tried to do is I tried to build a framework that would do this, and it would collect these stories, but in a very simple way. So I started by researching and collecting stories, and I was amazed that I didn't have to do very much research because the racist backlash against Chinese Canadians, it was absolutely insane. Like every day you could look into the news and see that there were attacks somewhere in Canada. So I built it, and it's based on four very distinct but related sections. The first one, which I'll get into in more detail momentarily, is what does racism feel like? And it's not just simple reports of racism that appear in the newspaper. They all do appear in some form of mainstream or secondary tier media in Canada. But they all answer the question of what does racism feel like? So in every instance that is collected here, and you'll see many of them, there's pages and pages of it, somebody has been reported in the news, and they've actually had the courage to come out and say exactly how racism has affected them. Okay, so that's what does racism feel like? And I thought, oh, this is good, but it's going to be a really sad story if all we're doing is reporting the racism. So I wanted to balance it, and I thought, well, what are Chinese Canadians? What is our community? What are members of our community doing to be part of the slogan that we often say is that we're all in this together. And I wanted to see what Chinese Canadians were doing. So I created another section called Allies. And Allies is a collection of other stories where not only Chinese Canadians, but Canadians at large were banding together, fighting against the racism, as well as banding together to help each other get through the pandemic. Another big part of the project is a toolkit, which attempts in ways to address what to do if you are the victim of racism. And we have another session that I call COVID-19 Stories, which collects what I believe are important milestones and stories and accounts about the experience of racism, but told more in a story format. So as you can see, we're now in this the part of the FaceRace website that deals with all these different accounts. You'll see that they're from all across Canada. There's a headline describing what's going on, and importantly, we've identified the cities and provinces across the country where everything's occurring. Right? There's a lot of things that are happening, of course, in the Lower Mainland of BC. There's a lot of assaults, and assaults and attacks. I mean, they're anything from microaggressions to hate incidents to actual hate crimes that are what might be being investigated by police, right? So you see some down here. There's some in Toronto. There's some in Calgary, Alberta, Vancouver, and BC. I wanted to, there, as you see, there's 4 pages of it here. I do, in fact, actually intend to update it. This is up until about the end of the year, into January. So there's been a few more cases since. But in all of this, I was struck by this one story here that I'd like to point to. And this is the story of an indigenous woman named Dakota Holmes, who was actually targeted for a racist attack while she was walking her dog in a park near Vancouver's Chinatown. So Dakota was walking her dog. She was approached by a white male who started yelling racial slurs at her and everything, and then blaming her for the China virus, which we know not to call it. It's COVID-19. It's not the China virus. It's not Wuhan virus. It's not Asian virus, whatever. And Dakota tried to get out of the situation and said to the guy, to her assailant, "I'm indigenous. I'm not Chinese." He kept going, didn't care, punched her in the face, and left her kind of dazed and confused and injured, and then took off. I was interested in this because, racism is indiscriminate, and to have a person of indigenous heritage and stuff identified as us, I mean, in that odd way, we truly are in this together. We as racialized communities, Chinese Canadians in our case, we need to work with and cooperate and share our experiences with other racialized groups. So Indigenous, Black communities, other communities as well. But what was really, really, to me, hurtful from the point of view of my Canadian identity in this is that Dakota was asked later on, and it's covered elsewhere in this coverage that you can click through and see the other elements of the story. Is she was asked to reflect back on what was going on. She says, "Well, I was shocked to be identified as somebody who's Chinese. I tried to correct it, she says, and then she says this: it is a traumatizing incident, but because I'm indigenous, it's sad to say, but I'm kind of used to this behavior. It's hard to get through, but it's just another day in my life." And so this really made me think, as a Chinese Canadian person, as a Canadian, how are we treating each other through this pandemic? And to read these stories, it can get you really, really down and depressed. I had to take my own mental health breaks as I was compiling this project and putting it together, because it got to a point where I was totally despondent about the whole thing. I talked to my friends, I talked to my colleagues and stuff in CCNC-SJ and at ProTech, and then I'd get back on track, because it's really important to me that we keep this documented history, this ongoing history, so that we have a record. And going forward, as we're building our community, as we're reaching out to other communities, very importantly, that we have something to refer to, that to the situation that we don't want to see happen again. So I'd like maybe at this point to I guess continue on with a description. Victoria can maybe do that with the allies section. And I don't know if before you want to discuss a bit more about the incidents, or
would you like to do a poll and see what our, to explore what our audience and participants can do if we are bystanders in this situation? I think that would be a
okay, yeah,
good point to continue.
Okay, so the poll is about witnessing a racist incident, and it says, if you are around in the parking lot or in a park and you witness this sort of incident, you would, and then it asks for to make a choice around several actions. So if you could
So
fill that in, and then we'll see what the results are. That'd be
good. This one you can definitely pick more than one options, right?
I think we can close it now, right?
I think
No,
people are still, yeah,
Oh,
still a few people responding. So I think it's really important to really look at our joint responsibility, right, in terms of fighting racism. And I think a lot of times we witness all sorts of microaggression or direct, blatant racism, and we can have a whole range of response. So I think that would be a good point to reflect. So I think we can close the poll now. So Brad,
that's actually really encouraging to see the result that the leading one was 67% is that provide support to the victim. Others at 33, or I guess, let's see, higher amounts would call for help, cry out to other bystanders, or report to an authority or police, or also is confront or call out the perpetrator. That's not a bad strategy, but above all, make sure that you're safe before you do anything like that. In our toolkit, and after researching all these things, I mean, it's hard to give sort of specific instructions about what to do, but the general gist of it is make sure that you're safe first. So stay safe, stay calm about it. And then later on, if you're the victim or if you're a witness, talk to other people about it, because those initial conversations that you may have with even just a friend or a relative are the beginning of a larger community conversation that eventually, if our voices get big enough, we'll be able to help each other and move on beyond all this, I hope.
just also want to add quickly to what Brad said about this FaceRace, and this really is an attempt from the organizers' perspective to engage the community, to understand and put this whole, unfortunate anti-Asian racism in the context of the historical aspect, the current context, as well as a discussion about community responses, community resilience, as well, of course, the importance of allyship. And so that, as Brad said, we're in this together until we're not, but we are in this together. And also it is so important for Chinese Canadians for us to always bear in mind that racism is not unique to our community. Anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism is so entrenched because of the colonial structure that we're in. And it is so important for us to understand that disparity, the differential impact of racism, the shadeism and all that, and our position in this whole context of racism in Canada. And so the whole FaceRace is a discussion, is a forum to paint the picture of being Chinese in Canada, our identity. And our identity has to be wrapped in that Canadian context, in that colonial structure, and in that context of solidarity movement. And I think I want to thank Brad for framing this and allowing us to have that discussion. So thank you, Brad. And I'll turn to Victoria to continue the other aspects of FaceRace. So.
Thanks, Amy. I'm just gonna share. Okay, so as Brad went through the ally section here, so this is also under the campaign. It's another collection of examples of people calling out in public about bringing attention to anti-Asian racism, also like on the solidarity piece as well. So we have also 4 pages of stories here collected. I'm just going to highlight this one, the Toronto for All campaign. Maybe you have heard of it. It's basically a campaign that the City of Toronto does to highlight issues facing different marginalized groups. I know previously there's been ones on people with disabilities, Islamophobia, etc. And there are usually lots of public ads, but because of the pandemic, this was a completely digital campaign, and it basically sought to challenge, get the public to challenge them to think about their unconscious biases. And of course, this was in response to the current context in the pandemic, where Chinese Canadians, Asian people, or as Brad mentioned in the past account with Dakota Holmes, anyone who looks Chinese, which literally could be really anyone, is being blamed for the virus, xenophobia, xenophobia. So we approached by the City of Toronto and with a coalition of other East Asian organizations, including Project Protect, and we did came up with a campaign to address these issues. So in the end, it created an online resource. There's also a short video as well, but there's a resource here on the website of the City of Toronto, and it will live up here forever, that basically highlights everything we just talked about. Mostly, we were just during the planning sessions, we were kind of talking about what the target audience might be, and definitely a lot of the stories that make the news are pretty. We weren't looking to necessarily change the minds of these super racist people who obviously are, their minds were not going to be changed. We were looking to kind of find allies or people who may harbor, like I mentioned, unconscious biases, and have some sort of stereotypes that they may not realize are harmful. Ideas like the perpetual foreigner and the model minority stereotypes that are harmful towards Asian people, and also barriers to solidarity between different groups of color. We had lots of, during the planning, we had lots of discussions about kind of the biggest issues that we are facing and the main messages that we want to get across. So I think the stereotypes were kind of the main things we wanted to bring across, because definitely they are very harmful. And as I mentioned, I would argue are the main hindrances to solidarity and also moving forward as our role as Asian Canadians in the social justice movements. And it's here it is. It's there's a toolkit as well, resources, and a lot of these issues, they're not new. It kind of come from the idea of the yellow peril, and how ever since Chinese Canadians have been in this country, they've been, and in the Americas, are seen as vectors of disease and otherized. So this campaign kind of just highlights that this is like the latest iteration of that, and how we can all work together to call it out, and also as Asian Canadians to question if we ourselves are harboring any of these ideas, and some of these so-called good stereotypes like the model minority actually are not a good thing and are quite harmful. So this was a campaign that we put out. We had lots of support from prominent Torontonians like the mayor, and we had a few other prominent folks to promote this message. And this was campaign. Yeah, I think we're gonna do another poll here, unless there's anything to add for this one.
So I think the next poll we want to explore roles of allyship, right? Again, you can choose more than one answer.
Yes. So what roles can allies help in our communities anti-racism efforts? And you can choose all of these: calling out different forms of racism, learning to respect the community's history, learning about experiences of racism, collaborating on joint public action, providing mutual support, educating personal networks, advocating for policy changes. And if you have other suggestions, please type them in the box.
So the resources here that you can find in the City of Toronto website, the Toronto for All campaign. In fact, it's in a way, a condensed version of our FaceRace campaign. So we actually shared with the coalition members, including ProTech and others. We share with them our FaceRace campaign and ask for their input to see what and how we can enhance it, and how, whether that resources in FaceRace would be appropriate for the City of Toronto campaign. In fact, all members of the coalition think that the FaceRace campaign, the materials are really rich and comprehensive, and would be very appropriate for the Toronto for All campaign as well. So that's why you will see that the resources sort of mirror, and it just is a condensed version.
So you can see the results in the poll, right, Victoria?
Yes.
Victoria, you're muted.
Oh, yes. Sorry, it's a long day. Yeah, so I think the highest one we got here is to collaborate on joint public action. I mean, all of them kind of checked off here. Yeah, I think an important thing, especially right now, is to encourage everyone as Asian Canadians, communities of Asian descent, to speak more about these within our own communities. Definitely, I think culturally, and this goes along with that's on a minority stereotype. We're taught to, keep our heads down, not rock the boat, and not talk about these things. But, as Amy mentioned, it's definitely a part of the history of this country. And it's really important, especially in this time now, to situate ourselves in that context and understand, the role of Chinese Canadians in this country, and as well, more importantly, like how we're situated in relation to other communities of color. So I think it's a really imperative right now that we start to think about that more, and also to talk about these things amongst ourselves in our own communities, so we can work towards healing, and also to be in coalition with others.
I just want to also add that the Toronto for All campaign actually allow us to build a stronger allyship with other East Asian Canadian community, namely the Japanese Canadians as well as the Korean Canadians. In fact, when I reached out to various groups, the response was instantaneous. I did not get a no to our invitation to participate in this campaign, because really, truly, this has hit hard all East Asians. Anybody that looks Chinese in this pandemic, of course, are experiencing, is experiencing risk. And East Asian in particular could identify with that. And when we were discussing, what are the most, sort of common elements of stereotypes and stigmatization that our communities have been subjected to. Immediately, model minority, perpetual foreigner came up. Japanese Canadian community, as we all know, many of them came very early on, and they were Sansei and even, you know, fourth generation. And they are still asked, like, how come your English is so good? Where are you from? And just like, you know, Brad's experience as a fourth generation Canadian. So through this kind of solidarity and collaborative work, we become less lonely, that we understand that this battle is not just our own battle, that there are many who actually do share similar experiences or do support the fight for equity, you know, that and do want to actually contribute to this discussion and contribute to this fight. So it's quite while the pandemic and those hate incidents and all those is very devastating and traumatizing. At the same time, it's really heartening to have this experiences of collaboration and support and solidarity through the last year.
So thank you for such a lively discussion and also a wonderful work and important resource that CCNC-SJ has put together. We have a few questions and comments from the participants actually, which kind of maybe the first one is more related to the allyship, collaboration, coalition building issues, right? So in more, I guess, in more practical terms, what can we do to confront white supremacy and the dominant narrative of whiteness? And I guess maybe, I think you talk about like collaborating amongst the Asian Canadian communities, but how do we work with the Black community and the Indigenous community more effectively? And what do we need to attend to and I guess reflect as a community in order to have more meaningful partnership, right?
Mm-hmm. And I think throughout this pandemic, we've all, you know, those I'm sure in the audience as well as amongst us, the panel members and others have participated in many different webinars exploring and discussing these issues. You know, it's really always, we start with the circle of influence, right? You start with yourself, understanding, of course, your own identity, your own experiences, and understand your own history. That means our Chinese Canadian history, the context, our experiences, our collective experiences. And then, of course, it's important for us to then also understand the Canadian history, the experiences of the Black communities and the Indigenous communities. Unfortunately, our textbooks, as we all know, are not the places where we will learn about this. So it has to be an active, you know, effort on our part to learn about that, to, you know, to understand that, you know, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, what they're recommending, the missing Indigenous women and children, girls, and what we can do to advance their justice, you know, and similarly, you know, the Black communities. And I think one thing about the unabashed attacks against Asian and Chinese in this should make us more aware of the brutality experienced by Black communities. Just being Black is a risk itself. And just being, you know, Chinese is a risk itself. Unfortunately, for the Black community, it's been, you know, around longer and more, unfortunately, vicious and in fact, more devastating. So I think we should, you know, really, first of all, understand that context, and then we can talk about how in each our position of influence, how we can, you know, work with the others, and again, choose something that you feel most comfortable with working with, right? It's joining an advocacy group, or, you know, or engaging in other actions that each one of us would feel most comfortable and most aligned with our own values and most aligned with our own, you know, circumstance.
Brad or Victoria, any?
Yeah, I'd like to say that, you know, I think I appreciate the question. what can we do to confront white supremacy and the dominant narrative of whiteness? I like the way that it's framed. It talks, and it has the key words of this dominant narrative. Well, yes, it is a dominant narrative, but we live in a country that has the political atmosphere and freedoms and social freedoms that allow us actually to challenge these narratives, these dominant narratives. In my own case, like I a fourth generation born and bred here. I grew up in Western Canada. I moved up to Toronto about 20 years ago. Worked in Asia and the whole thing. I thought I was pretty solid in my identity as to who I was as a Canadian. My experience, of course, that I talked about, and sort of comparing what was happening in Singapore and then coming home to racism. I almost thought it would go away, but I had this this experience in April. I had to go and get some regular medical tests done for a meeting with my doctor. And I walked into this clinic in Midtown Toronto, and I walked in, and I sat down. They were going to take some blood and everything like that. And I walked in. There's two racialized lab technicians that were there. I started talking to the lab tech that was drawing blood from me, and he's from Egypt, and his colleague was from the Caribbean. Everything was going just nice, having a nice conversation, talking about concerns about this new virus, but we weren't at the level of really, really big measures and stuff yet. This Caucasian woman walks in with her son, and she's just glaring at me and staring at me, and she says to the lab techs who are also racialized, she says, "Oh, you people, you frontline workers, you're so brave. You never know what kind of people will come in here." And she's glaring at me, and she's making all these passive aggressive remarks. And the Canadian in me wanted to stand up and punch her, and the Chinese Canadian in me says, "Oh my God, I've been through this so many times." And it was, but then it sparked this epiphany, and thought, hey, I don't have to deal with this stuff if I don't want to. And eventually I can work with my community. I've talked to people about this incident, and now through FaceRace, I'm perpetuating that story, but just sort of as a way to be reflective and self-reflective about the experience and what I might do to change it. So some of the other things that I've done since being involved with CCNC and then CCNC-SJ is I guess maybe about 20 years ago or whatever, I decided not to accept that the dominant narrative of whiteness. And after we did the, I guess it was in 2006, we got the parliamentary apology for the head tax and the Exclusion Act. I started doing a bunch of other historical reclamation projects, critical rethinking of history, and using the same documents that some people would go in and interpret and come up with a white dominant history. I came up with histories that were full of life and that talked about my community, that rewrite the history of the railway and the Chinese railway workers, but from the point of view of the descendants of Chinese railway workers. I talked about the story of the Chinese Canadian war vets who fought for this idea of what Canada is during the Second World War, and yet at the time they weren't considered citizens. And as I went through all these different experiences and saw what people in my community, in my Chinese Canadian community had done, I started to build this idea that we don't have to be defined by whiteness and dominant narratives. We're defined by our own narratives, which in the Canadian context is resilience. Resilience is my story, it's my identity. And as a Canadian, I'm super proud of it because it also establishes a strong sense of belonging.
Mm-hmm. That's great. I don't know if Victoria, you want to add something. I want to also pay some time to our next question, which I think kind of connects, but like maybe Victoria can make your comment as well on the last.
Yeah, I definitely think it's really important to answer that question. We need to definitely divest and decenter from whiteness and white supremacy. A really difficult thing that we need to do is, as Amy did touch on, is grappling with the idea that we experience racism, but we also benefit from our positioning and in this racial hierarchy of anti-Blackness, and those two things are true, and we have to sort of understand that. And speaking on the whiteness and white supremacy, weaponizes people of color, especially model minorities. And we really need to reject that bait of respect and humanity, because as this pandemic has shown, and as the previous examples have shown, like, it's very conditional, our sense of belonging. So that should really help move us towards solidarity with other folks.
Definitely, I think that this is wonderfully eloquently said. I think the other key issues that we wanted to, that's raised by another participant. Hold on one second. And there's a comment from the attendee with the WHO in Wuhan investigating the COVID-19 origin. There's a fear that any findings would result in more unabashed and unhinged blaming and attacks towards Chinese Canadian. So how can we as a community or individuals manage those perceptions and the repercussions, as there is very little repercussions for the perpetrators? So I think that also ties into the fact that I think the last point Victoria mentioned, we need to recognize our privilege and social positioning, right? And the hierarchy of access and to resources. And I think for a lot of the Canadians who haven't been aware of the connections to history and the communities that we have, like a lot of newcomers or people in our community who work in very precarious situations, they would not have those support to even deal with those incidents. And then they would, be just directly filtered from, all this unabashed racism that, get perpetrated from a day-to-day level. So how would you think that we as individuals and as community can plan around those scenarios?
So I think, ultimately, all these questions are the root of this is white supremacy, racism, systemic, and all that, right? So all the strategies that we have, individually as well as collectively shared, is to challenge that, right? Is to challenge the supremacy, is to challenge that structural inequalities, those, the entrenched hierarchy of racism and discrimination. So, but I think this question about, being Chinese Canadians, and then we get blamed for whatever happens, in the geopolitical, dynamics of what happened in China and between China and Canada. And that we Chinese Canadians be blamed because, first of all, we are never seen as Canadians. We will always be more loyal to China than to Canada, just like Dr. Teresa Tam was being blamed for. And as well, there is also the element of Chinese Canadians feel obligated that we have to respond to, I don't particularly feel we need to respond to whatever happened in China or, however, I do want to respond when people would blame me or blame all of us here for, whether it's virus or whatever actions that are totally unrelated to us. And so I think it is important for us ourselves to be clear about our own identity. And Brad always remind us that Chinese Canadian identity is important. And then you position yourself, and you'll also be able to then, sort of screen out, and not be affected as emotionally. However, I am most affected emotionally is about here, racism here, and the injustice here, and the targeting here. So those, I would urge all of us to put the center and the focus here and address those issues. And of course, I think, unfortunately, the reality is racist will always be there. We, CCNC, and I'm sure Victoria has always have to deal with these, trolling and these racists, coming to our website and Instagram and Twitter and emails to us personally or, collectively. And I really, honestly, I have no time for that. No time for those individuals who are racist. If they attack us, of course, we deal with that. If there's a physical attack, if there's, that perpetration that hurt people, we need to deal with that. But that online or that, that kind of, I have no time for spending to deal with that individual argument, engaging in that debate. My attention will always be dealing with the systemic issues and strengthening ourselves and reinforcing our own identity and building our own resilience. Sorry, I get angry when I talk about these things.
We'll
Yeah,
give
but-
Victoria first, because before Brett this time, maybe. Because
Yeah,
I think.
I will let Brad speak. I know we're short on time, so.
Oh, okay. Just in one instance that CCNC-SJ did respond to racists is after we called out Canadian music rock star icon Bryan Adams for being a racist with his Instagram post earlier on. We had a number of which we had a bushel full of racist responses. But we took it as an opportunity to get the last word in and wrote a letter back under the COVID-19 stories section, back addressing the racists specifically. But that's the thing here is like as Amy says that people might target China, but I'm not China. I'm Brad Lee, Chinese Canadian. I live in Canada. And the thing is it makes it kind of complex for us is that we have a lot of people of Chinese heritage and ethnicity moving into Canada as new immigrants and everything like that. And they're coming here, and it takes a hell of a lot of courage for a Chinese person or family to uproot from what they know to come here and try to set up a life. And that, in fact, is the story of the immigrant in Canada that everybody respects. We all do. But when those people, when new immigrants get here, they may be targeted and stuff by their origin or whatever, but they're trying to be Canadian. Let's give them that chance, but also let's welcome them in and talk to them about, having racial awareness in Canada. Now, one thing I'll say through all of this is that being the racialized victims of white supremacy and other forms of racism is, and this kind of really irks me as a Canadian, is that I even have to deal with this, that I have to tell people that I was always born here. I have to tell them that English is my first language and all this kind of crap. But the thing is too, is that as a racialized victim, you might not want to be educated about anti-oppression. You might not want to be educated about racism itself. I didn't want to deal with it for many years. And the perpetrators will always go away still being ignorant. They don't have to do any work to change it at all, because why do they want to? But for us and our community to change things, we will become more educated. The more we understand about it, the more we understand about the social dynamics, the politics and everything like that, we have become educated, and as a community organization, we'll work towards changing things. When things come up in the press that we don't like, when Derek Sloan, the Tory MP, questioned Dr. Theresa Tam's loyalty to Canada or China, we started writing letters. We got into the newspapers so that in the public forum of discussion, people knew that there was community opposition to racism. So please, whatever you do, don't be afraid. If it starts only, and you don't want to be public, that's fine too, but start talking to people. Build the conversation. Every little bit helps.
Thank you, Brett. Victoria?
Yeah, just to echo that, I really think every as Brad mentioned and Amy mentioned, there really is no point trying to argue with these racist people and change their minds. It really kind of starts with this sort of internal healing, as I talked about, learning about our own identity, where we're situated and everything, and starting to have these conversations. Social change is not linear. There's lots of back and forth, and it truly, as Brad says, every little conversation helps to move the dial forward, and also to get people thinking about the stuff who maybe have, you never know, it might open their entire mind to learn more about history and social theory and all those things I really enjoy. So let's keep talking about it.
And so we are towards the end of our session, but I think I might want to integrate the last comment and question from the audience with maybe like a kind of closing question, which relates back to the call for action and reporting of racism incidents. So one of the participants asked, what do you think the major reason for people underreporting racism? And I think as people who've been involved with CCNC, who've dealt with reporting various kind of discrimination, we know that there is a lot of trauma and a lot of price to pay in terms of like having to report such things. And I guess in my personal experience, my awareness is that a lot of people think that it may not lead to any change, right? And to rehash that traumatic experience is not necessarily a very, forthcoming thing. But I think from hearing what you've been talking about, like the value of documenting those experiences, the value of not just releasing our anger and frustration, but actually make it public and make it explicit to a wider audience, I think is part of the healing. But I guess the other question then would be beyond that, what do you want to do with the information that would motivate, people from sharing those lived experience?
So just add to it, Alan, if AV Go, who was spat on and did not report, so you can imagine how many people did not report their experience. And so I think it's that there's no blame, there's no guilt, in not reporting. It is very, very difficult and very traumatizing, as Alan said, to come forward as a victim. So I think it is important to, first of all, recognize that. And as we've been talking about the whole night, right, that the unfortunate, the oppression that we are all experiencing is meant to keep you in your place. It's meant to make you not speak up, right? So it is like because the system we are in, that's why people are not reporting. That's why we are subjected to this kind of, this kind of narrative that is not our collective narrative and not our collective experiences, right? So it's okay that we recognize that. However, though, in order for us to advance, right, again, how do you build that solidarity? Is to recognize the various positions that we are in, that people in positions of power, people with the privilege that some of us, in fact, all of us here in this forum have, to utilize that and to embrace and to include and to reach out, to the best that we can, to tell the stories that, people cannot tell, to share the lived experience that people are not willing to share. So it is, that I think we really have to always look at what the power that I have, how can I best use that influence and power? And so the organization has power, the collective has power. And we need to recognize that and you build from there, right? And you then, sort of reach out beyond then Chinese Canadian community to beyond and bring in the allies and and that's how change is all about. That's where change comes from.
So
can I just add one thing? Within the toolkit, what to do if you're the victim of racism. It's actually based on personal experiences that I've documented, and I've spoken to both the people that I use their stories. But one to look at under the tab of build your own resilience. It's the example that Filipina Canadian who lives in Toronto, Justine Abigail Yu, she was accosted, accused of being responsible for the Chinese virus on a schoolyard. And she responded on social media in a series of Instagrams that basically put her into the national news for about 3 days running. If we mount this sort of resilience and this sort of opposition to these racist attacks, we turn the dynamic around where that self-consciousness about whether or not I should do anything will be on the racist rather than on us.
Thank you, Victoria.
Yeah, just to echo what everyone said, I think definitely, reaching out, sharing your story, reaching out with others. And if this is your first time experiencing something like this, and I really hope it wakes you up to learn more about the whole structure of why these things exist, and to also help out others. Equity scarcity is a myth. Helping out other groups will help all of us, and we kind of have an ethical duty to do so, I think. So I think it's just speak out, share, learn more, and learn about other people's histories and stories. And I think we just need to keep talking about this more and learning more.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Rain, do you have any comments, or do we want to administer the last poll? So we'd like to thank our guests for sharing this really important and meaningful dialogue with us. And I guess what I'm learning and reflecting is that really, I think speaking up and speaking out is really an act of resilience and an act of resistance, right? And I think if nothing else, it destigmatizes the victimhood, and we need to not internalize that oppression. And if we don't speak up, we're actually endorsing that white supremacist narrative. So I think even just sharing that, it connects us to community, it destigmatizes the experience, and it really expresses and build our resilience. So I would strongly encourage it. I know it takes a lot of effort, it takes a lot of courage, but I am sure that seeing there's a lot of supportive communities here, hopefully, we would all support each other and help build a stronger movement for all of us. So I'd just like to thank everyone. And if you can also fill out our exit poll, that would be much appreciated. And we have our continuing series of community partner showcase. Next week, we would be featuring our collaborators, Vision Youth, in our community partner showcase. Next Thursday is Lunar New Year's Eve, so we're gonna take a break from our workshop. So after that, we will be launching another new series of resiliency dialogues, starting with a discussion on how to deal with discrimination at the workplace. And then we would also be integrating more mental health wellness strategies with the broader resiliency dialogues discussion come the new year. So Happy New Year, everyone. And thank you very much for your
Sorry, Alan,
Yeah.
can I just add one more thing?
Sure.
As part of this project, actually CCNC-SJ will be rolling out the last piece of our program, which is tools for children and guardians. And these are videos, infographics, as well as videos of kids, hopefully, speaking about racism, anti-Asian racism, anti-Black racism, and anti-Indigenous racism. And the purpose is to engage a household to talk about this. Because when we were doing our focus groups, we realized that Chinese Canadian kids, both in Toronto and Vancouver, and their parents rarely talk about racism at home. In fact, we notice that even children that they know there's racist bullying, they probably have experienced that, but they don't want to talk about that. It
Yeah.
is probably for self-preservation. And so these tools are meant for
Well,
that kind of dialogue. So we'll
yeah,
share
we will
some when they're
definitely
ready.
invite you folks back for another dialogue because we think that is a very important topic, right? We're gonna talk. Some of our upcoming topics include like workplace racism, racism in schools, and I think the talking about racism between parents and intergenerational conversations are really important. We also wanted to have more expanded discussion about coalition building and anti-Black, anti-Indigenous racism, and also looking at sharing inspiration of different strategies across Canada. And then we wanted to also share self-care strategies, collective healing strategies, how to deal with COVID fatigue and Zoom fatigue, and all of those things that will keep us energized and resilient and keep us going for the new year. So thank you very much. Yeah, so the toolkits hasn't been launched yet, so Amy will keep us all posted, and we will definitely link to all these resources when it's released. So thank you all for participating, and have a wonderful Chinese and Lunar New Year, and good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.